Okay, tonight's topic is preparing for recording. I don't know if you guys are aware of this. Not only do I teach music, but I also have a recording studio at my house, and I record bands. And it shocks me how many young bands just are never prepared to record their music. Not even young bands, even old bands, or old humans in new bands. Some people just are never prepared to record, and it's disappointing to me because preparation can save you money and make an awesome record. So we're going to look at a few things here. Okay, music dissection. I'm a pretty firm believer in really pulling apart your music as best you can. When I write a song, and you don't have to get this nerdy. I like to because I'm a nerd, so it's not like a huge stretch for me to do this. But what I like to do is I'll write down the parts of the song. So like intro, verse, and maybe it's verse A where the guitar is strummed, and then it's verse B where the guitar is palm muted, and then it goes to the pre-chorus, and then the chorus, and then the post-chorus, and then maybe a transitional intro-ish part back into the chorus, or back into the verse, or whatever you're going to do. But I document all of it, and I write down what the arrangement is on each part. And I try to make sure that the arrangement is consistent, and it doesn't get overly boring, because I feel like a lot of times what local bands do is they might play, you know, if the first verse is 8 measures, they might play the first 4 and the second 4 the same. Then when they get to the second verse, they play the first 4 and the second 4 the same as they did the first time. And to me, that's boring. I'm not saying that you have to like change your riff and like you're gonna strum a G chord the first time and then have like a sweep arpeggio the second verse or anything like that. But like, if you listen to the last song I taught tonight when I was teaching guitar was Bleed American by Jimmy Eat World off the record Bleed American. It's a good song. And the first verse is 8 bars, and the first 4 bars are just palm muted chords, and then the second 4 bars are the same 4 palm muted guitars, but the second guitar changes a couple of the notes just a little bit to differentiate those 2 parts. And then on the second verse, it's the same core chord progression. Guitar 1's still doing the same chug riff, but what they're doing is they add a different variation on the second guitar part, and it's just enough to keep those parts different. So that way, as a listener, I'm always engaged. And I think it's easy to do that when you have a keen understanding of what your arrangement is. And, you know, so documenting it in a notebook. So when I write a song, I just toss it in a notebook, and so I have the core concepts of the song, and I can kind of evaluate the strengths and weaknesses on paper. But on paper doesn't necessarily mean it's going to sound good. But I'm a big fan of mapping out the parts. This is going to sound crazy, but does everyone in your band know their part? And can they play it well? I'll be honest, the answer is almost always no. Not everyone in the band can play the part, which is unfortunate. And this usually leads to a bit of like an ethical question for some band member. When you watch one of your band members, I'm looking at you bass players, struggle with playing a part on time or to the beat or, you know, with a solid rhythm, and someone else in the band can play it better, but as to not hurt the ego of whoever's playing the part when they're recording, you just let them struggle through it like a fish out of water. That's the worst. Just whoever can play the part, get in there, play the part, and just be done with it. It's not an ego thing, you know. Save the ego for the stage. When it comes time for the studio, just do whatever it takes to play it, you know, cleanly, properly, in time, in tune, and to the beat. I know it sounds crazy, but it always blows my mind where there's like a band with like an amazing guitar player, and then a bass player who's just like kind of playing the dots a little bit, on the fretboard, the dots. They just kind of like use their one finger and go from 3 to 5 to 7, and you just watch him struggle. And the guitar player, is trying to be nice to his friend, and I don't feel like this is a question of nice, especially if you're in a situation where you're paying a studio for the hours that you're in there. So if it takes them an hour to play 2 songs on bass, when it could have taken you 15 minutes to play it, you've just wasted an hour's worth of cash. And when it comes down to that, I feel like if you have that conversation ahead of time and just say, hey, whoever, if someone's struggling with a part and someone else can do it better, we're not hurting feelings. We're just in there trying to get it as quickly as we can, get those parts nailed. I think a lot of times if you did some research on some of your favorite records, you'd be shocked to find out that there might have been other players on there, or you correlate a band using a certain guitar or amp or drum kit or something like that because that's what you see live. But at the studio, they're just going to use whatever. So you kind of have to break that mold. I remember for me it was Worship and Tribute by Glassjaw. I really liked that record, and the rhythm section in Glassjaw is what made it for me, and that's unusual for a hardcore band for me to like really get into the rhythm section, but they're so good. And then I found out that drummer was not the drummer that played on the record. I was like, oh wow, and I read the backstory, and I won't bore you with that, but it's on the internet if you want to read it. And it's like, wow, they didn't use this amazing drummer on this record, but it still sounds good. Cool, So don't, as long as you have the discussion ahead of time with your band members and just say, hey, look, this is not an ego thing. It's just a money thing. We will play, whoever can play this part the best, play that part. But at the same time, if everyone practices properly ahead of time, chances are you won't have to have that discussion, but just prepare for it. So there's another concept here. This is on the paper. It says, is the band well rehearsed for the songs on the record? So that brings up a discussion. What type of record are you planning on recording? To me, I feel like there are 2 options. One is the AC/DC. Like if you put on Back in Black and you listen to it, you just hear 4 or 5 guys in a room playing the song, and that's what it feels like. That's what it sounds like. When you see them live, it feels and sounds just like that, which is good. They nailed it, and I couldn't imagine any other sonic representation for AC/DC. Steve Albini, classic recording engineer from Chicago, Electrical Audio Studios. He only records bands ideally that can do it in that fashion, because he says that an album should be a sonic fingerprint or a sonic photograph of what the band is. It's not like, oh, we should bring in this string section and this choir to put on this part because that's what it needs. I'm looking at you, Metallica, nothing else matters. It should be, what does this band sound like when they play? And then let's record that so when we listen back, we could hear this band playing. And I get that is an admirable way to make a record, and I feel like it's dismissed a lot these days. Local friends of the Oasis, the band Dr. Manhattan, just put out a record not too long ago, and that's how they did it. They did it live at Chromatic Studios in Crystal Lake, which is cool. I applaud their efforts. But on the other side, and this is probably the more widely used way to make a record these days, is just overproducing it and that overproduce isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just everyone plays their parts and then layers and layers and layers of stuff is added. So if you listen to a Muse record and you hear 400 vocal tracks and pianos and synths and guitars and bass and all this other stuff, but when you see them live, they're still a three-piece. They cannot play all that stuff, so they play to a track. That's their option. Realistically, if the song that you hear in your head has 11 trumpets, go for it. Write a song with 11 trumpets. You might not be able to perform with 11 trumpets, but that shouldn't limit you from being able to write a piece of music that you want to write. So when you're rehearsing with a band, you have to know what direction you're going to record in. So a lot of times a band will come in to record with me, and I'll be like, so, a lot of times this is discussed ahead of the time. But like, if a band comes in, I'm like, what are we doing? Are we recording live, or are we doing it track by track? And they'll look at each other and be like, oh, I guess, I don't know, I haven't really considered it. That's usually that's a fairly large red flag for me. Like, this is going to not go well. And then they're like, well, what do you recommend? And like, if you discuss that ahead of time, you should, have a rough gauge of what you are anticipating to achieve in the studio that day, or what kind of sound you're looking for. So if you are going to record with someone, you can say, hey, I like these 5 records, and hopefully that someone will know, or at least have a guess as to how those records were made. So if you send me like AC/DC, early Van Halen, stuff like that, probably going to record live because that's how they made those records. But if you send me like, the stuff that Deer Hunter's been doing, or is it Behemoth? Yeah. If you send me a Behemoth thing, they probably didn't play live. That's my guess. So at that point, it's usually drummer tracks this stuff. A lot of times these days, it used to be bass next because you're establishing the rhythm section. But at some point, the concept of having a profound grooving rhythm section kind of lost some value, and it was replaced with awesome guitar tones. And I'm not complaining because I'm a guitar player, first and foremost. But the overall idea was that if you recorded drums and they're done, you might have, if you lay the bass parts down next, and then you go to dial in the guitar sounds, you're going to be dialing in a guitar sound that fits with that bass tone that's already been captured, instead of throw out the bass, because it's just bass anyways, right? And then create the biggest, sweetest guitar sound you can, and then track the bass after that. If I was making a heavy record, that's definitely how I would do it. But if I was leaning indie rock or something like that, I'd probably let the band decide. I know that Adam D from Killswitch, when he produces records, he owes drums, guitars, bass. But I mean, at that point, it's just, primarily the band's preference. So next thing that when a band comes in, hopefully I always send them, what's on the paper here in some capacity. I'll say, drummers, are you prepared to play to a click? And most drummers think they can, even if they haven't. That's a guaranteed failure. If they hadn't prepared before the recording session to play to a click, I don't let them play to a click, because it's a waste of time. Every time it's a waste of time. Just because, it gets in their head, the performance is lost usually. Like, even if they can kind of play the song to the click, the natural vibe of them playing drums has just been killed, because they're just trying so hard. It's like tightrope walking. Playing drums to a click is hard, and then playing drums to a click while the red recording light is on and the rest of the band is up against the glass watching you, making sure that you don't play poorly, that's a million times harder. So, make sure that your drummer is playing to a click, and make sure that as a band you've documented what those tempos are. That just, it seems crazy, but like I'll have bands come in and be like, yeah, we're ready to play to a click. I'm like, cool, what's the tempo? I'm like, oh, yeah, hold on. And then they bust out their phone and they're trying to like figure it out. Like, well, maybe you did play to a click once, but this is not a good sign. Just prepare ahead of time. 2014, we probably all have phones in our pocket that can tell us we can tap the tempo of a song in, and it can tell us to a decimal point what speed we're tapping, which is awesome, by the way. Silver Dial is my favorite metronome. It's on the iOS. Tough to beat, in my opinion. Okay, lyrics and melodies. I'm always surprised as to how many singers come in with things incomplete. Like, oh yeah, I still have to finish lyrics for this song and this other song. Oh, okay then. Well, you get to work because you're up next. So, and depending on the type of band that I'm going to record, like traditionally singers are planning like, oh, well, everyone else will do their stuff and then I'll record vocals. Are any of you guys singers? Okay, that's one of you. I'm assuming you've recorded music before?
Yeah.
Have you ever tried to record 5 or 6 songs straight vocally?
No, I know you want to attempt it.
Exactly. So, if the drums are tracked and we have some scratch guitars, I might send the singer in and say, hey, get a song in, and then record some bass. Hey, go get a song in. So that way you don't cache the voice, you don't kill it, because it just blows my mind how often singers just think like, oh yeah, I can record 7 or 8 songs right in a row, and in regards to what these meetings are really about, it's bands on a smaller scale. It's different if you have a budget and 2 weeks to record, but most people are trying to record in a weekend or shorter. So asking your singer, even if it's hardcore vocals, to and you kind of want that tough guy, Paul muted, vocal sound, it doesn't mean you're going to get the best performance. And the second that someone is thinking about something other than their performance, that track is pretty much done. So when the singer is in his own head thinking like, oh, my voice is shot, or I need water, or whatever, that track is probably done, and it sucks. And I remember early on recording a record. I was helping some of my students record, but they were recording at another studio. So I was just kind of there as the translator for the engineer who was working, who was an adult, and I was older than the students, so I was kind of translating, young high school speak to engineer guy, and he wanted the vocals to be tracked last. So the singer had to track vocals for 8 hours, and it wasn't great. He was not a happy kid at the end of the day. So if you're planning on bringing in lyrics or melodies but no lyrics, that might throw off the entire session, because they're like, oh, I was just going to finish the lyrics while everyone else is recording. It's like, no, should have planned ahead.
That's always first for me anyways. I always have lyrics done before anything else, because I just usually end up taking the stuff I've written, poems and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, you are one of a few, but not one of many. Most singers aren't what I would always refer to as overly prepared. So the other thing I like to do is, let's say a singer is prepared, has all lyrics and melodies, and then they're like, okay, I want to do some backup vocals, and they're trying to figure out what the harmony would be. Like, that could probably be prepared ahead of time. Do as much on your own as you can, so that way when you're in the studio, it's just one thing after another. Knock them off. Really, you're making a checklist before you go into the studio, and then you go through and check it off. On that checklist, there shouldn't be anything that says write vocal harmony. It should be sing vocal harmony. Check it off. Get to the next one. It always shocks me. Like, okay, yeah, we definitely need some harmonies on this part. Guitar player will think of 400 little cool guitar riffs to add into a song, but singers won't remember to write a harmony or a backup vocal that maybe not be a harmony. Something I like to do is when I'm writing lyrics, whether they're mine or helping a band, students, or like if I'm in a producer role for someone who's recording, take lyrics, and if there's going to be a high harmony over a lyric, I put a line over that lyric in the notebook. If the part is going to be doubled, and this is definitely for like hardcore vocals, I put a line through it, and if there's a low harmony, I put a line under it. So that way when it comes time, it's like, oh, this line has to be harmonized. I'll have a lyric sheet, and the singer has their lyric sheet, and everyone's on the same page, and it just makes such an efficient recording session. It's the way to go. Couldn't recommend it enough. So one other thing on here is whether or not you're planning on using an outside influence for a producer. Chances are that, on this level, no. That's my guess. They usually cost money. But if you go to, a decent recording studio, every engineer fancies themselves a producer. Like, I don't think anyone hoped to be the guy that, gets ordered around by a producer. Like when they started their path on trying to be a recording human, they're like, man, someday I'm going to be ordered around by a famous producer. No, they want to order people around. They want to be the producer. So they'll probably have good ideas. And, don't take offense to these, engineers or producers or whoever it is, when they say, hey, that part was not good, play it again. Or you can play it better. Or every note you sang was flat. I think you need a new singer. Just don't take offense to it, because it's, that's just how it goes. They're help. No one gets better when people just tell them how good they are all the time. You have to have someone saying, keeping you in line, and say like, look, you can play that better. You're not on the beat. You're behind the beat. You're in front of the beat. You're too sharp. You're too flat. There's a valuable role in having an outside influence for the recording process. For that is just having someone who is not immediately associated with the band and is willing to give you an honest opinion. Most of my guitar students will say that I have been brutally honest. At the very least, I've always been brutally honest. I don't sugarcoat things, because you're not getting better. You're not getting better when everyone's like, oh, yeah, after the show, and everyone comes up to you, and you're you're a Swedish black metal band, and someone's mom comes up like, that was good. You know that she doesn't mean that. Unless she's wearing a Swedish death metal shirt, someone has to say, hey, that was pretty good tonight. Your tempos were mediocre. You're ramping up the hard parts or the heavy parts, stuff like that. Which is, I don't know, I find that valuable. So, basically, to help with all of the things that we just kind of talked about, I always recommend some basic form of pre-production. And pre-production is when you make demos before you go to the studio. I don't believe that you can really accurately listen to and critique the quality of your song while you're playing it. There's too many other factors. So to be able to listen back to the song and say, oh man, that part is a train wreck. It doesn't actually work. It seems to work when we're playing it, but when we listen to it, it's like, our tempo drops, or it just doesn't fit. Like the flow is gone. All of those things that might get lost in translation while you're playing. It's always worth listening back. And fortunately, like I said before, we probably all have phones in our pocket that could work to make demos, whether it's you have like actual 4-track software, which you can download cheap. The iPhone and a 4-track app is essentially what I started recording on, except mine used cassette tapes, and cost 4 times more. And it just blows my mind that we have this little tiny device that we can carry around with us. It doesn't, obviously doesn't even have to be a phone. It could be the iPod, that runs apps. And you just plug a microphone into it. I have a lot of times that when I rehearse with my band, if I don't feel like setting up the full recording gear to record a rehearsal, I have a little iPhone mic that I just plug into the bottom of the phone and just press record and we play. And it gives me, it doesn't sound great, but it gives me something I can listen back to. And I find it so valuable to just be able to sit there and be like, oh, that part is good but not great. Or that part's great, and that other part, it makes the other part so much worse because it was a weak part to begin with. You know, so it's nice to be able to accurately listen to and critique your songs. Not to mention the fact that you could forward, even the crappiest of demos, you could forward them to your recording engineer, who you can get a feel for what the songs are going to be like, so that way they know ahead of time, you know, what they can do to help help move forward. Those apps are especially great for working out vocal harmonies. If you don't have the ability to record otherwise, you can just do a voice memo of your primary vocal line and then try, you know, harmonies and things like that on top, which is great. I'm thrilled that we all have built-in recording studios into our pockets these days. So the other thing I like to do is I just have a notebook for if I'm writing a record. I'll document the whole process from the, you know, write down the song like I was saying before, do the structure, you know, the structure and arrangement. It'll have the tempos there. Next page will be lyrics with overscore, underscore, whatnot, and then, you know, I might start thinking of production ideas like, oh, I really like this, you know, guitar tone on this Muse record, or, you know, whatever it is that you like. You can bring that in and say, hey, studio guy, I have some basic notes here, and it will always help, always. So last one, and this is a rough one. Avoid studio distractions. Usually they're female, like we're all male in here tonight, but like I hate saying it, someone brings a girlfriend, so that person is then occupied or preoccupied, and then their presence seems to always interfere with everyone else getting what's needed to be done. You know, it's any distraction. So even just having a friend there can be a distraction. You know, everyone should be there to get to work, because, you know, like I said, chances are you're paying by the hour, and it rarely has any sort of benefit. So just make sure that, you know, the distractions are limited, and, you know, and then that could be, you know, don't bring your Game Boy, or, you know, have your phones on silent, stuff like that, you know, just to make sure. And what always bums me out is when a band member finishes their section, like, hey, I'm done playing drums, I'll see you guys later, and they take off. Now, granted, they're no longer a distraction, but they're not there to enhance it either. They're not there to say, hey, guitar player, you were behind the beat, or, you know, your note was flat, as if drummers could hear pitch, right, guys? Jesus. Okay, anyways, but, you know, when a band member leaves, they can't be engaged with the process, and that's always rough. It makes things harder than it's needed to be, and I feel it's the same thing with when you have cell phones, like, constantly out, or video games or whatever. Like, if the cell phone's out and you're texting your significant other the whole time, you're not listening to whether or not the guitar part was on time. You know, like, everyone should be engaged with what's happening. You know, you're making a record of combined, you know, musical influences and musical instruments, and so I don't get why people just, like, disconnect the second they're done with their part, because it should be a shared thing. So it's tough, you know. Try to pare it down to the minimal amount of distractions, whether human or otherwise. Okay, so a little more specific nerdery on actual instruments. So with drums, said before, metronome, get your songs tempos documented and comfortable. Really, what I think is great is when the drummer practices with headphones on. Because when you go into the studio, you practice or you play with headphones on. That's just how it is. So if the drummer has a preferred set of headphones, whether it's over ear or in ear, make them rehearse, have a few practices with those headphones on. Because I've had a few drummers who, like, they practiced and then they put the headphones on and they're like, oh, this interferes with my movement. It's weird and I don't like it. And you know, you gotta go through that process a few times to be totally comfortable with it. So it's worth preparing. This little paragraph here, preparing your drum kit. In the studio, having a little more space between your drums and the cymbals, it makes a world of difference in terms of the overall sound, in my opinion. I've had some drummers who just they want to use as much stuff as they can. They want a lot of cymbals and a lot of toms and extra, splashes or bells or whatever it is that, drummers want. So because they have so much stuff, it's all kind of squeezed together. And the cymbals might be sitting right over the toms. And what ends up happening is, one, there's not a lot of room for mics. And then two, there's a lot more bleed than you might have wanted otherwise. So the toms might have some cymbal bleed on there. And that's going to interfere with how I'll be able to EQ it, and it might sound not great because I've literally had a drummer's ride cymbal that when it was moving came within an inch of the drum head on a tom, and it's like, man, there's not a whole lot I can do here, you got to be able to spread it out. He's like, oh, but I need it there for my fill. It's like, I wish you would have prepared a little bit, and you make do, obviously, but there is going to be some light coloration on that tom because, in comparison to the others, because of how close that cymbal was. Even with a noise gate, that ride cymbal is going to be vibrating and resonating and sustaining after they hit it, and then if they hit the tom afterwards, it's going to be in there. So, create space with the drum kit if you can, even if it's just an inch for everything. It just makes all the difference in the world. Supposedly that's why Dave Grohl plays with his weird setup. If you've ever seen Dave Grohl play, his hi-hats are like you feel like he reaches above his shoulder to play his hi-hat when his snare is closer to normal snare, knee level snare. It's insane. So all of that just allows I can mic the snare cleaner when the hi-hat isn't right above it. Keeping the cymbals away from the toms, keeping the toms even away from each other a little bit. If you have 3 rack toms and 3 floor toms, that the proximity will make a difference. So, if the drummer has their own drum rug, it's worth taping off where cymbal stands were and things like that, just to simplify it. It's the same thing as having the little mic box. Or you've taped a little square on your cab to say this is where you can put a microphone and it will sound good. Same thing on a drum rug, just kind of tape off where the stands and drums will be. It helps setup go by a little quicker. Make sure that you're, hopefully you have new drum heads, unless you're going for a really garage rocky dead drum sound. Just new drum heads and stretch them out and make sure they're in tune. Make sure that when the drum heads are off, you've checked all of the screws to make sure that there's nothing loose. And if you have older drums, sometimes they have dampeners where it's a little knob that has a piece of felt that can go up to the drum head, so you can dampen the sound. Make sure that that's not rattling. Realistically, a lot of times you don't hear too much of the rattle, but sometimes you do, and it's annoying. You want to make sure that you're starting with just, at the very least, a good sounding drum kit without any other issues. The drums are in tune and there's not a lot of rattle. And drums can be tuned. They can be tuned to pitches, so you can actually tune your drums to the song if that's how you want to roll. There's some pretty cool drum tuning apps these days that are unbelievably effective. They're really technologically advanced and pretty cheap for what they are. You can do that, or you can kick it old school, use like a drum dial, or even older school. You just use your ear. It's crazy, but it works. The ears are impressive. But if you're going to use the house kit, just kind of trust whatever the engineer has to say about that kit. A lot of bands use my drum kit. I have an old 70s Ludwig Vistalite, which is cool and big rock, like Led Zeppelin, John Bonham sound. But if they're playing, death metal, I tell them to bring their own drum kit. Although if they're playing death metal, they're probably programming the drums anyways, at least these days. Bring extra sticks because it's not a gig. If you mash the tip of your drumstick at a gig, you can probably tough it out and finish the gig with that drumstick. But in the studio, that changes the tone. So if you break the plastic tip on your drumstick, you need another. It's going to be an inconsistent tone. So you want to try and keep it as consistent as possible. So it's just something to consider. Hopefully drummers just have extra drumsticks all the time. But I've been shocked, like how many drummers just like bring a pair of sticks, they're brand new, should be good. And I'm not worried about necessarily the construction of the stick, but if that tip gets mashed or breaks off, now what? So just some thoughts for strings, so bass and guitar. Just have your instruments set up. No one sets up their instruments before they record, and it kills me. A setup really is cleaning out the electronics so that way they're not scratchy or they don't have any issues. If there's a 9-volt battery for active electronics, that gets replaced. There's new strings put on. The fretboard is polished, and usually that means like polishing the actual fret wire so it's nice and clean. If there's any issues with that, it can be filed out. Making sure that if you've changed gauges, the nut has been properly filed to fit the strings. Making sure the action is appropriate, and you should know what action you like. If you do a lot of bends, make sure that it doesn't fret out when you bend high. And then the biggest one is intonation. And a guitar could play well and have nice clean frets and the electronics be nice and pristine, but the intonation can still be on. The intonation is the exact length from the saddle to the nut. And if you check your first string open and it says E, and then you hit the 12th fret harmonic and it says E, and then you play the 12th fret on that string and it's a few cents flat of E, your intonation is out, and your tuning will be an issue during the session. And that gets overlooked so much. People bring in their guitars, it plays great. It's like, yeah, but it's not in tune, So you find people like, maybe I'll just tune it just a little off so it's in tune, or maybe I'll bend the strings a little bit when I'm holding this chord. It just doesn't work, and that's usually when I say, okay, can't use that guitar. But realistically, like I said, there's no reason to be overly attached to a specific guitar unless it has a function. If you're Tom Morello and you need all the kill switches and whatnot on your guitar, that's different. But if you're just going in and playing, making a rock record or a metal record, chances are most guitars will work. If you're making a metal record, probably active pickups. If you're making an indie rock record, probably not active pickups. And if you record, I feel like a lot of the people who record around here have a decent collection of instruments that you get kind of pick from. So I just can't stress that enough. Make sure that that instrument is, if you intend on using that instrument, make sure it's set up. You can go just about anywhere. Ryan, who's an employee here, can do setups. He works cheap. I've always used my friend Chip, who basically opened Hamer and Dean guitars and set up those back in the late 1800s. That's what it feels like. He does great work. So, I know it might seem obvious, but bring extra strings when you go to record. Hopefully you won't break any strings, but you might. Or maybe you just have such horrible corrosive sweat that the strings rust out within a few hours. And if it's a heavy guitar record, in terms of like there's a lot of guitar tracks, and the guitar tone is starting to get a little dull because those strings aren't as bright, you gotta change them. It sucks, but you gotta change them. Know your part. I said that earlier, but just know your part. Be able to play it really, really well. For a lot of heavy records, all parts are duplicated, and you want to be able to, you're going to put up a few mics on a guitar cab, and you're going to play your riffs, and then you might switch out the guitar, or maybe you won't. Maybe you're just going to just literally double it. You make some new tracks, and you play that same stuff again, just to have the thickest, heaviest guitar sound you can get. I know on, I feel like it was the end of Heartache by Killswitch Engage. It was 2 mics on the cab, and then do tracks with a 5150, and then do tracks for the other speaker with a 5150, and then they changed it out for a Framus Cobra and do tracks with that, and then track, other speaker, do tracks there. And I feel like then it was one more, it was a JCM 800 2210. They did the same thing. So we're talking 12 tracks, 6 per speaker, essentially. And regardless, you throw out whether you like the music or not. All of that is subjective, as subjective as guitar tones. But it is a big guitar sound, and in my opinion, it's a pretty cool guitar sound. Not that it's something I ever trying to achieve or attain. It's not my thing. But I remember listening to it and be like, wow, they got that right. It sounds good. So, you're asking someone to be able to perfectly replicate that track that many times. So it's tough. You have to really know your part and be 100% sure that you can play it accurately and solidly. It's a big one. So, something else to consider. The tone that you use live rarely is the one that works best in the studio. Even AC/DC, when they're all in the room jamming their Back in Black, the sound that they're using live is not necessarily what they're doing in the studio. Most people think of Jimmy Page with a Les Paul slung low and a wall of Marshalls behind him. But a lot of those classic guitar sounds that you think of are actually these little 5 or 10 watt Supro combo amps. They're little because you can turn them up really loud. Well, turn the amp up all the way, and the SPL, the sound pressure level of the amp, is not like, it's not going to kill anyone, unlike cranking 4 Marshall stacks at the time. That probably would have killed somebody. So a lot of those tracks where you think like, oh man, it's this huge Led Zeppelin guitar sound. Kind of. It is a huge Led Zeppelin guitar sound coming from a very tiny, Supro amplifier. So, like I said, you just kind of have to get over what you think sounds good in the studio because of what you've seen. I feel like a lot of people listen with their eyes. They walk in, like at my studio. Before I ever had a studio, I just liked gear. I just bought a lot of gear, and I've always had a lot of gear, and buy and sell and flip and just kind of accumulate probably more than I needed. But now that I'm recording bands for a living, not a terrible thing to have a wall of amplifiers. But it always shocks me where someone's like, oh dude, I want this heavy, sweet, like crushing guitar sound. I'm looking at that Vox because I've seen those are awesome. It's like, well, the Vox is primarily a clean amp. Think of the intro to Where the Streets Have No Name by U2. It's closer to that, or maybe some of the the thinner, lighter Brian May Queen crunch tones. And like, no man, I'm gonna gent with that thing. It's gonna be awesome. And it's like, no, you probably won't. You know, it's like, and I'm not trying to argue. Like, we could certainly set it up, but I've set up enough amplifiers for people now to where they're just like, dude, it has to be the JCM 800. That thing's amazing. And they hear it, they're like, oh, why isn't that amazing? It's like, well, it's subjective, you know? Like, are you aware that there were 4 different JCM 800s, and each one is kind of different? So just because it says JCM 800, do you know it's what the difference between the 2210 and the 2203? You know, that's where you have to trust whoever the gear owner is. You know, if there's a studio engineer who owns all that gear. Like I said, if you come over to my place and you're like, hey man, what's that Laney amp? And I'll be like, well, it's a pretty cool high gain, you know, listen to Opeth or Ocean Size and you'll have a feel for what this guitar sounds like. And it's good. And you'll be like, oh, okay, let's try that instead of the Vox. I think that'll do better. So you just, like I said, make sure that you're not just listening with your eyes, you know. Just because it says JCM 800 or Mesa triple rectifier doesn't necessarily mean it's the answer. Almost always isn't. So you just kind of have to explore. Also, you have to be mentally prepared to try new things. If you are certain that you want to use your live rig, and your amp has been retubed and rebiased and it's in good shape, and your guitar has been set up and it's in good shape, and you turn it up and you're like, yeah, listen to this guitar sound. Again, what works live doesn't necessarily work in the studio. So chances are you might have to adjust what sounds good. You know, like maybe you have tape on your amp or your amp case with the settings that you use. Those settings probably won't work when you go to record. A rule of thumb that I usually give people is that whatever gain you use, turn down 50%, because in the studio, a little goes a long way. And when you use too much gain, you lose the clarity. I would rather use 50% of the gain that you're comfortable with and add a second track with 50% of that gain to fatten it up, compared to just putting the gain at noon or more. Because that to me is just, you're asking for trouble, and it's I would rather have a little extra clarity than a little extra mud, and that's really what gain is at the end of the day in the recording studio. So like, say you bring in your 5150, like I said, what works live probably isn't what works in the studio. And realistically, there's so many other factors. You're not necessarily just listening to your guitar, amp, and cab. You have to think, okay, there's one ribbon microphone, there's one condenser microphone, there's one dynamic microphone, all on that speaker. So what do those sound like? What are the EQ curves on those mics? What type of preamps are those going into? What are the EQ curves on those preamps? What you're listening for is that end result, not necessarily what's in the room. So I feel like a lot of people, they hit their open chord and they're like moving that treble just like 0.5%, and they're like, oh, there it is, that's the sound. And they hit it, then they walk into the room, the control room, and they're like, why does my guitar sound so dull? It's like, oh, it's because it's not necessarily being represented accurately yet. There's going to be some mic placement, that has to be done. And at the end of the day, a good engineer should be able to somewhat accurately replicate the sound that's in the room. But having been that engineer a lot of times, sometimes the sound that's in the room isn't the one that should be recorded. Sometimes I will take matters into my own hands and, adjust. Like if metal guitar player, dials in his presence and treble, up to 3 p.m. on their knob, I might, kill that by moving the microphone a little bit just to kind of undo some of the harshness that they've dialed in. So trust the ear that's in the studio as opposed to what worked at rehearsal or live. And then, like I said, sometimes the guitar or amp that you brought just might not be the answer. And maybe it's not even because they weren't set up. Maybe everything's working fine. They just don't sound good. You know, like they work great live, but when you go to record, it just doesn't. You know, it's just not happening. The sound isn't magical. It should always be magical. So another thing that guitar players should do, in my opinion, unless you're making like an AC/DC style record, think of some production tracks. This is pretty common. It starts with pop radio. All the music you listen to on pop radio just has layers and layers and layers of cool synths or guitars or vocals or whatever to kind of fatten out the tracks. They'll have a lot of little things instead of a few big things. And I feel like guitar players don't utilize that enough, where they'll write the rhythm guitar and they'll have that locked down, and they're ready to record it 2 or 3 times to fatten that sound up. And then they have their lead guitar part that sits on top of it, and that part is ready to go, and it's all locked in, and they know what they want. And they're like, okay, now it's done. And then when you go back and listen, it's like, vocals, bass, drums, rhythm guitar, and lead guitar, and all of that stuff. It makes the song, but it doesn't make it great. I feel like all the little things are what make it great. I always use the analogy of the riff sandwich, because I like riffs and sandwiches. So my idea here is that if you brought me this song that's equivalent of like white bread and bologna, by definition it is a sandwich, right? Or a song. It's gonna suck though. I know going in that it is not good, right? It's just not what I'm looking for. If you improve the quality of the things that make a sandwich, or intro, verse, chorus, bridge, really to me, verse, chorus, bridge, that's a song. Those are the 3 primary components. So verse, chorus, bridge. Bread, cheese, meat, right? So white bread, bologna, American cheese, technically a song, technically a sandwich. Every time you improve one of those components, your sandwich or your song gets better. So a nice pretzel roll, some good cheddar, maybe some roast beef. Now we're talking. This is a sandwich that I'm considering eating, right? And now the core of the song is there. If you go to any sandwich place, they have like endless options that you can toss on your sandwich, right? You go to Jimmy John's, they had sprouts and lettuce and tomato and all that stuff. If you handed me all of that stuff on a plate and said, here's your sandwich, I'd be really disappointed, because it's obviously not a sandwich. If there's just like a puddle of mustard and all this extra crap, onions and all that stuff, none of that successfully makes a sandwich, but all of it makes a sandwich better, right? So like if I have the core components of a decent sandwich, like roast beef and cheddar and pretzel bun, and I have onion now and mustard, all of the things that don't stand up on their own, but they all supplement this sandwich. Same thing with the song. I feel like too many people come into the studio with this, sadly, a lot of times white bread, bologna, American cheese sandwich that they want to record. But, let's say they've put some time into it and they've improved this, and they have the roast beef, pretzel bun, aged cheddar, maybe cheddar jack, we'll see. They have that ready to roll. It's all those little things. Going back to the Jimmy Eat World song that we talked about earlier, that second guitar part on the verse, perfect. Honey mustard, right? If I heard just the part on its own, I probably wouldn't be impressed. Same thing if I walked into a sandwich shop and they put a thing of honey mustard in my hand, I'd be really disappointed. But it took that verse over the top for me, and it's all of these little things that can take a song over the top, but they don't stand up on their own, nor should they. They're just there to support the quality components of the song. And more often than not, that's on the guitar player, I think. Just because they're the ones who are coming up with the progressions. And we kind of, in a previous meeting, we kind of talked about a little bit, to me a song is three components. The progression, a structure, and a melody. And those three components, utilized properly, create this song. And usually the progression comes from the primary songwriter. Like, most vocalists can't create a chord progression. They can't influence that part of the song. Guitar players, or primary songwriter, so it could be guitar or piano or something like that, or even bass to a certain degree, although it doesn't seem to be as common. They're the ones who are putting the rough structure in order. So whoever's doing that should be starting to think about the other things that can add to it, whether it's adding some backup vocals to the back end of the song, or an extra guitar part at the back end. Maybe, and these things don't have to be performable. Like, it's just to take the song over the top, to make sure that it's not just a boring plain sandwich. And I know it's a dumb analogy, but I've used it forever, and I feel it makes sense to me. I guess the other side of it that's worth mentioning is a sandwich with every option is not good either. So just because you can write a part to a song doesn't mean you should add it. I feel that some people think it's cool to, go to a sandwich shop and say, yeah, give me everything, just on the bread, please. So just all of it. And although technically, it can be done, it's not going to be good. And I feel like a lot of songs are that way too, where they either, they're just like bread, meat, cheese, where they're just kind of adding this thing, up to where the song is too long or too big, or just, there's too much, or they add so much of the little stuff that the core components get lost. But I always love it when a guitar player comes in, plays his rhythm tracks, plays his lead tracks, and says, okay, I actually have another layer here. It's going to be lower in the mix, or this little delay line will just be panned over here. Just like little things that take it over the top. Honey mustard, sprouts. It really, like I said, just kind of take it over the top. So that's all I got for tonight. I'm open to questions if you guys have any. If not, you should all hang out for a while and just talk to each other.
Totally had one.
What's that?
I forgot what I was going to ask. I had a question.
You had a question? Is that a hand up?
Yeah.
Okay, lay it on me, dude.
Where do you record out of, and what are your rates?
I record out of my home, and it's in Wildwood.
What is that?
It's, yeah, do you know where CLC is?
Yeah?
It's on the other side of 45,
Oh, okay.
the wrong side of the tracks. Yeah. I mean, realistically, just a basement with a lot of stuff in it. And rates normally are $50 an hour, or $150 for 4 hours, or $300 for 10 hours. Because hour blocks, that's usually what people are buying. No normal bands ever just get an hour. That's usually for you'd be shocked, but the amount of corporate voiceover work is substantial. So I'll get a call from a company yeah, we're doing a video, we need to just get some vocal tracks. Oh, okay. So but I like me, and I think I'm pretty good, but there's also a ton of awesome recording engineers just attached to the Oasis even. So if you're looking to get your stuff recorded, explore what all that Lake County has to offer, because there's some real good people out here, and I don't want to put myself in front of them. Question?
I totally remember.
Okay, lay it on
Am I
me.
going to be able to get that guitar text number that you're talking about? Because I have a 1983 D,
I've seen that thing.
Yeah.
He probably worked on it when
I need to
he
get
was
that,
young,
like,
many years ago.
yeah. So I figured I'd take it to him.
Yeah, there's a long story attached to that, so we'll talk here momentarily. Other questions? Lay it on me. Yeah. Who are you?
Andrew.
Hi, Andrew. How you doing?
Good, how are you?
I'm okay.
Earlier you talked about how what you play with live might not always be what you used to recording.
Uh-huh.
How can you figure out beforehand what you want to use for recording? Is there any way to prepare for that?
Yeah, it's trying to figure out what tones you like and research that. So just there are a lot of awesome websites that kind of document what bands might have used in the studio, and they're just a Google search away. What bands do you like?
Chevelle, Deftones,
Okay, so I'll save you some trouble. Now, Chevelle and Tool have both recently recorded with Joe Barresi. He cut his teeth with Queens of the Stone Age early on, and like the old Caius records and stuff like that, and built a pretty good reputation. Dude can capture a mean guitar sound. The majority of Tool's catalog, Adam Jones has used primarily the same rig. 80s Les Paul Custom Silverburst, because he thinks the silver has a different tone to it because the paint aged differently than other guitars. I actually have one, and I'm inclined to agree, but I have no way to prove it. And then he would go into his pedal board. It's kind of essentially been the same for the length of Tool. And then into a handful of amps. The early amps was an old Marshall Super Bass head, which is like a Plexi era one-channel amp that it sounds good, and then you turn it up and it sounds better. They're just amazing, and he just cranks it and it sounds good. And then he also uses 2 diesel amplifiers, which are awesome if you have $4,000 each. So that's $8,000. And there's a lot of that sound in there. But like the second you hit an open drop D chord on a diesel amp, you're like, oh, it's Adam Jones. You don't even need a special oddly aged silver Les Paul Custom from the early 80s. Like, you could just use a regular Les Paul Custom, or really just about any humbucker guitar and be like, that's in the ballpark. That's primarily what he was using. But when they were making 10,000 Days, they had a bunch of random amps that they were using in the studio. And I feel like a lot of people, they're like, oh, I got to figure out what tool to use in the guitar, or when they're recording the guitar. They'll read the issue of Guitar World. No, that's not how to do it. You find the recording magazine with the producer or engineer. You read that, because he'll lay down the goods, and that's a fun lesson to learn. But they used a couple different PB amps during 10,000 Days, which shocks me, because rarely do I think I need to go to use this PB amp. But that's me. Chevelle would be, for a long time they used Mesa Mark IV amps, and they're good. They're good amplifiers. These days, I think they're on to Mark V. But I mean, there's not a whole lot that was particularly special. I think they just did double track, Mark IV takes. Once upon a time, Chevelle's from the area, and once upon a time, you could talk to them more frequently before they kind of blew up. And they used to shop at a store that I worked at on occasion, and I was asking Pete about the recording process during Wonder What's Next, right after they got picked up by Epic. I think it's Epic. And he's like, oh, it's crazy, the amount of effort that goes into the guitars and setups and tunings and keeping the amps in good shape. And he's like, and you record 8 seconds of music, and you're like, nailed it. Okay, tune up. Okay, we're gonna do it again. You record 8 seconds of music. He's like, okay, nailed it. Let's tune up. And it's just, he's like, the whole record was made 8 seconds at a time. 8 seconds, tune. 8 seconds, tune. So it's Tool, Chevelle, and Deftones. Deftones are all over the map, and I feel like their guitar sound is good because the production and the band itself sounds good, more so than the tone itself. I feel like a lot of times when you listen to the tone on Deftones records, like you just try to like tune out everything else and just listen to the guitar tone. It's not great. Like, it's really harsh. And I think early on he was using like the Marshall JMP preamp. These days he's rocking an Axe Effects rig.
And what's weird about Stephen Carpenter is he actually plays like he doesn't have really a bridge pickup. He has more of
like the middle, like
a
a
middle pickup.
like a 75%
Yeah.
pickup. It's weird. He's a weird guy. I remember reading an interview with him years ago where he's just like, yeah, like I thought I was playing like the heaviest stuff I've ever heard, and then someone told me Meshuggah existed, so I listened to that, and that was so heavy. So I kept trying to make my guitars sound like that, and I kept breaking them all, and like nothing was working. I was breaking strings, and they wouldn't stay in tune, and I was so pissed off because I just got endorsed by ESP, and their guitars weren't doing what I wanted them to do.
Then he has the Barrett.
Then he's like, then I found out that they were playing 8 strings, not 6 strings. So he's like I wrestled with it for like a year trying to figure
I
out.
didn't even know that's why they play 8 string now.
Oh yeah. I mean, rumor has it on the most recent. Yeah, they're gonna go 9 strings. Like, I don't even get it. Like, why not just play bass? You know, like, I don't. Why do you need 9? Why can't you just get away with 2 at this point? But Meshuggah, you know, like, it's not something I traditionally listen to often. But when I want something to scratch that itch, Meshuggah usually does it. So I'm not gonna. If they want to play 9-string guitars, go for it, because they've earned it. You know, that intro riff to Bleed hurts my arm when I try playing it.
And I just think it's funny. It's like the more strings they add, the closer just to a normal 4-string bass.
Yeah, they're they're just inching themselves closer to the, you know, just playing bass.
Yeah, like I know for a lot of their more recent stuff, like their bass players playing at the same octave as they are.
Yeah, which is ridiculous.
Just because it gives clarity.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it makes no sense to have your arrangement to be, you know, 3 people all playing within the same, you know, 6 frets.
Two to the crowd.
Yeah. Interesting thing about Deftones, real quick. You know, after their bass player got into his accident and disappeared, and they scrapped an album, and then they recorded a new one with the bass player from Quicksand, which was a good move. If they had to get a bass player, they did a good job there. But they released Diamond Eyes, right? And that record rules. And I remember, I'm so excited. I got it, and I put it in my computer, and my computer is set up in my whole like recording studio, control room, fun stuff, and I'm playing, and Diamond Eyes kicks in, and that song just like beat me up. It was so heavy and so awesome, and like everything about it, every part just cut. I'm like, how could a band that is tuned this low and everything is this low, how does everything sit in the mix just so cleanly and so tightly? And it was just like beating me over the head with these riffs. And then track 2 kicked on, and that's a good song too. But I noticed, I'm like, I'm not getting beat up. Like, this is a fairly like comfortable listening experience, and it's not to say that the first track wasn't, but there was something different. And I put on track 3, I skipped forward. I'm like, this is like track 2. And I kept skipping forward and forward and forward, and from 2 to the end of the record, they all were very consistent. And I go back to Diamond Eyes, and just again, it just like slaps me in the face with these riffs. I'm like, God, this is owning me differently than the rest of the record. And the songs are good, the production's still good. What's his name? Nick, incredibly German, long last name. He recorded and produced the record, and he mixed the record too. I can't think of his last name. And he's done a ton of heavy records. He's the next Joe Barresi as far as I'm concerned. He did like a lot of the more recent Coheed records and just a ton of awesome heavy records. But Diamond Eyes, that's the song, right? This opening track? Yeah, that song just like, I just kept hitting back. I'm like, why is this just, it just pops differently and just brutalized me. It was awesome. So I went onto the internet, because that's where you learn stuff these days. And as it turns out, Nick, incredibly long German last name that I can't pronounce, producer engineer, did not mix that song. He mixed the rest of the record. But they got a guy, Chris Lord Alge, who's like, he's the man for mixing. Like, he's about as good as it gets these days. He's probably one of the top 3, you know, in terms of mixing. And he has golden ears as far as most people is concerned. And he mixed that song, and that was just like a big, you know, big eye opener of, like, you know, the great and the best. What's the difference between the great and the best? And that's a good example. So when you go home, go listen to the, you know, just track 1 right into track 2. Listen to the difference in terms of how the kick and the snare cut, just the overall tonality of the snare drum. And there's not, it's not to say that one's good and one's bad. They're just different. And personally, I prefer the way Diamond Eyes pops. And, you know, it just does everything I'm looking for on a heavy record. But I'll never forget that experience. There's a handful of those weird, like, listening experiences where you're just like, what is going on?
That was like when I first heard Be Quiet and Drive from Deftones. Like, it was my first Deftones song I ever heard, and I was like, it starts out with that weird, like, lo-fi beginning, and then you're just like, whoa. And like then that was pretty heavy, but now it's like you listen to that and then you listen to Diamond Eyes, and you're just like, it's just.
That song may as well be a ballad these days compared to what Diamond Eyes or Deftones are putting out. They're a weird, unique band, and I'm looking forward to whatever they want to do next. They're a big fan of that band. Any other questions? Okay. I'm off to a fantasy football draft. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Cool. Thanks for coming, guys.